Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute for what comes next, a look at student borrowers in default. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar and deputy director of education policy studies at AEI, and we're pleased to have this event on these two reports from AEI and the Urban Institute. Recently, student loan default has received a lot of attention from both the research and policy communities. Let me just lay out quickly that defaults are when a student who has gotten a federal student loan and that loan has come due has not paid on time for 9 months. That's what a default is. And the Department of Education projects that more than a quarter of all federal student loans to undergraduates will end up in default at some point. Today, there are 8 million borrowers with student loans in default, or about 1 in 5 borrowers whose loans have come due. But researchers don't really know much about what predicts default. So much so that one of the studies you'll hear about today is one of the first to use credit score data to look into this question. And we know even less about what happens to students after, or borrowers rather, after they default, and the myriad of options they have to negotiate as they try and put their loans back into good standing. So accordingly, AEI and the Urban Institute have conducted new research on what predicts default and what happens afterwards. So a little bit of housekeeping. We'll have 2 panels, the first of which I'll introduce in a moment. We'll have a very brief break in between the two, mainly to switch chairs. The event is being live streamed, so we welcome all our online viewers, and full video will be posted online after the event is over. If you are on Twitter, we have an event hashtag, that's hashtag after default, and we invite you to chime in with questions or comments wherever you are. Both of the reports are available here in hard copy, and they'll also be online for your reading. Please read them after the event. So now I'll introduce the panel, and I'll invite the panelists to come on up and take a seat as I introduce them. Jason Delisle is my colleague and a resident fellow here at AEI, where he works on education financing with an emphasis on student loan programs. Jason started his career on Capitol Hill, but he's also served as director of the Federal Education Budget Project at New America. And in the past 6 months, Jason has conducted dozens of interviews with policy and industry experts on the policies and practices that dictate what happens to borrowers that are in default. Kristen Blagg is a research associate in the education policy program at the Urban Institute. Kristen's research is among the first to use credit bureau data to evaluate the relationship between credit scores and student loan default. And she's conducted numerous studies on student loans and the role of information in higher education. And finally, Josh Mitchell is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal's Washington, D.C. Bureau, where he covers the U.S. economy. Josh has covered the rising level of student loan default rates, along with other policies related to student loans, borrower repayment, and higher education. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh, who will moderate our panel.
Thanks. So let's get started by just having each of you sort of share briefly what you found.
Yeah, so Nat mentioned some of this research, and I have some slides here. One of the things we hear about with student loan defaults, there's a lot of interest in people not paying their student loans, who they are, and what sort of statistics we have on them. And when you see default described in sort of the press coverage, and when you hear policymakers talk about default, it's just sort of described as this terminal status. The borrower defaults, and that's it, right? It's really bad. They defaulted, sort of, but end of conversation. And it's also sort of this indicator of sort of, it's supposed to be this indicator, is sort of implied, of financial distress. And I think some of this comes from sort of, we're trying to draw a parallel with what happens to when people default on loans in the private sector. Right? It's sort of some sort of financial disaster, and they sort of walk away from the loan. The loan is a total loss, and that's a default. But I've often wondered, with respect to federal student loans, if that's really an accurate description, which is sort of meaning what happens after somebody defaults on the loan. And because the government actually has a whole bunch of policies, right? And we're here at the American Enterprise Institute. We're interested in public policy. And so I thought, well, if there are policies that kick in after somebody defaults on a loan, and as Nat said, there are 8 million people who default on federal student loans who are in default, then these policies are being used a lot, and they're really important. And so how do they work? What happens? And so we conducted this sort of research and inquiry in two ways. And the first way is sort of based on data. And we have some data on borrowers, a cohort of borrowers who entered school in the 2003-04 academic year. And we can see their loan balances. So we can see if they've defaulted. We can see a few things about them, and we can see their loan balances. So we thought, well, why don't we look at people's loan balances after they've defaulted? 2 years, 3 years, 5 years out. And one of the really interesting things that we found is a lot of people exit default, which is not really part of our general understanding of default. Right? So this slide is showing you that after 5 years, about 70% of people have exited default, and 30% remain. Right? So the 30% is probably a little bit more consistent with the description of default, although clearly a big problem. Right? 30% of people are still in default with their student loans. And at this point, I should point out that the federal government doesn't really have a concept like the private sector of if you default on the loan, it's just charged off, and it goes away, or it goes to collections, or you declare bankruptcy, or that the debt just somehow disappears and is uncollectible. The federal government keeps the loan on its books forever. And that's a very unique situation, right? But you can see that 70% of people are somehow resolving the default. And the question is, sort of, that we got immediately was, well, how are they doing that, right? How do people get out of default? If so many people are getting out of default, what are they doing? And amazingly, one of the main ways that people are getting out of default is they're paying off the loan. So they're going a year or longer without making payments, they're being declared in default, and the loan sits there for a while, and then they start making payments on the loan in default. So this whole concept of these people in default, you can have someone who's in default who's actually making progress paying down their loan. And oftentimes rapid progress. Because this is one of the other interesting things is that, and people have started to know this in the research community, that most of the defaults are on fairly low balances, $6,000, $7,000. And so you can see how someone might make payments on a loan like that and get out of default fairly quickly. Oftentimes, though, they're making payments involuntarily. Because the federal government will garnish wages if you're in default, and they'll also seize tax refunds. So some of these full payoffs are what we would call involuntary, not necessarily people just writing checks. And so to the point, and I'll also mention here that the other sort of default exiting is people using policies the government has put into place to let people get out. One is called loan consolidation. Another is called rehabilitation. You can read about them in the papers that you picked up here. But they're really just sort of administrative processes that a borrower would follow and fill out a lot of paperwork, sometimes make some small payments, and then have their loans put back into good standing. They haven't actually paid down the balance, right? But they've exited default. And we see this. This is another common way that people exit default. Strangely enough, though, like I said, that people can be in default and making progress paying down their loan. People can exit default, and what we see more often than not in the data is that people who exit default using rehabilitation and consolidation don't make progress paying down their loans afterwards, which is a very sort of strange, sort of puzzling situation. This shows you balances, and I have just one more slide after this. I'll be brief. This shows you loan balances, the balance that the borrower defaulted on, and the change in the loan balance after the default, right, over a number of months. And you can see that these low balance borrowers, who are the bulk of defaulters, are paying down their loans rapidly after default. The high balance borrowers, relatively high, right, around $10,000, $20,000, make almost no progress after they've defaulted. So there's just sort of these very, very different pathways. Now, the other part of the project the other thing we looked at with respect to defaults was what happens with respect to collection fees. Right? The government charges collection fees to borrowers who've defaulted. And people accrue interest while they're in default. The government charges interest on these loans the entire time that someone is in default. And so we wanted to sort of do a survey of what are the fees and how do they relate to the different ways of getting out of default. And we sort of settled on these are the various ways that people can get out of default. They can make a big lump sum payment. They can have their wages garnished by the government. They can have their tax refund taken. Both of those things could happen at the same time. They could reach a settlement with the collection agency. They could do a consolidation after making 3 payments. They could use income-based repayment and consolidate, or they could rehabilitate. If you're really confused by all these different options, just imagine if you've defaulted on your loan and a collection agency is trying to walk you through these things. I mean, it's got to be maddeningly frustrating, very confusing, but on top of it all, it's actually really unfair. Because if I write a check to the government to pay off my defaulted loan, I'm going to pay collection fees of about 25% of the amount I defaulted on. And this is on a $7,000 loan. So this would be the collection fees on a $7,000 loan I defaulted on. It's almost $2,000. But I've fully paid off my loan. But if I consolidate my loan by making 3 payments, and then my loan is put back into good standing, I pay only $191 in fees. But I haven't actually given the government really any money back yet. So the system is set up to sort of treat these people very, very differently, and it looks pretty unfair. And so in the conclusion of the report that was handed out today, we have a series of recommendations on how to just make this more fair, make it more simple, collapse a lot of the options, and treat people who get out of default similarly with basically similar policies. And you can read about those in the conclusion of the report. Over to Kristen.
Hand over the clicker here. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. In looking at these different aspects of default, Jason was looking at federal loan data and following this cohort of borrowers in a federal data set. In contrast, I was using a credit bureau data set, looking at sort of a random 2% sample of creditors that have student loan debt. My interest in this really came from the fact that we do know a substantial amount of the types of people who default in terms of the institutions that they might come from, the backgrounds that they might have, and there's some really great work done in those areas, even on the types of incomes that defaulters might have. But we know less about the types of other debts that they hold or the financial circumstances. So using this credit bureau data set was really an attempt to get a better understanding of the other types of debt that these borrowers are holding and how those debts might give us a better sense of what's going on when individuals default. So the data set that I'm using is a panel data set of student loan borrowers from one of the 3 major credit bureaus. I can basically follow them over time, and the cohort that I'm choosing is a cohort that appears to be starting to enter student loan repayment in 2012. So when we follow these borrowers who appear to enter repayment in 2012, we can get a sense of how they're doing on repaying their student loans over time. So this it's called a Sankey chart, shows the status of those loans in terms of the worst ever status that borrower has reached over time. So most people, I'm getting them captured at one point in the year. Most people, when they're captured at that point in the year, are still current in 2012. By 2014, some borrowers have defaulted. That's that gray portion. And then by 2016, some of the borrowers that are delinquent have even recovered back into being in current status, but others fall into a default status from early or late delinquency. So we can see that Some borrowers are hitting late payments and then making a recovery, while others are actually going into default. And while I don't show in this chart, some borrowers, even over my period, are going into default and then, as Jason alluded to, exiting default and returning back to active repayment. So when we're looking at the other holdings, the other types of debt that the borrowers are holding, there's a stark contrast between those who will default and those who won't. So this is the holdings right in the year before they enter repayment. So they're entering in 2012, and they start repaying. So I'm looking at their debt holdings in 2011. The blue borrowers are defaulters, and they're much more likely to have utilities or medical collections debts, and much less likely to have debts that might be backed by underwriting or risk assessment, such as credit card debt, auto loan debt, or mortgage debt. Interestingly, not much difference between the people that have filed for bankruptcy in the previous year, and you see that throughout the panel that the likelihood of actually filing for bankruptcy in the data set is pretty low. Not a lot of student borrowers do that. Similarly, I'm able to connect my borrowers to the neighborhood that they're living in each year. And in the year that they enter repayment, borrowers who default in alignment with previous work are more likely to be borrowers of color, more likely to live in neighborhoods with a population of adults that have less education. And in line with the holding of collections debt, borrowers also tend to have, borrowers who will default tend to have lower credit scores. So the credit score that I use is the Vantage Score 3.0, which does a good job, actually, more so than the FICO score, of capturing people with relatively thin credit records. All the same, there is a proportion of borrowers that don't have a credit score, and they tend to default at about the average level of when you're looking at people that do have a credit score about the same. And interestingly, those neighborhood characteristics, those traits, are really somewhat outweighed when you look at the types of debt or the credit scores that borrowers have in the year before they enter collections. So while where you might be living, or our estimate of sort of your own background seems to have a little bit of an impact on your likelihood of defaulting, your own personal financial background seems to be a stronger predictor. And finally, I think a lot of people are interested in what actually happens to your credit score when you default. So this shows the cohort of borrowers that have defaulted at some point over the panel. That's the circle. And one of the things that's sort of notable about this is there is a substantial hit of maybe 60 to 80 credit score points. But many of our borrowers who default started off before entering repayment with a fairly low credit score. Not everyone, but on average. And also, that the credit hit appears to take place while the borrower is going delinquent. And this is not netting out any of the other effects, such as the other points of distress, like other collections debt that may accumulate as the borrower is going into default. But generally, on average, a substantial hit to credit score, but also a recovery as well. So when thinking about these results, like Jason, you start to ask yourself, well, how can we best assist borrowers who despite the availability of forbearance, despite the availability of deferral of a student loan, or of the multitude of income-based repayment options, are still defaulting. And I think this begs the question of getting a better understanding of borrower circumstances, perhaps a better understanding of how we can use these data to identify borrowers who are at risk of default and generate incentives for them to keep their loans in good standing.
Thanks. I have to warn you, if you see me look at my phone, it's not because I'm texting with a friend. I took notes last night on my phone. So, anyways, so it sounds to me, Kristen, like we made a whole lot of loans to consumers with subprime credit for what we thought would be a safe investment, but lo and behold, they're defaulting on their loans. Where have we heard this before?
It's a different problem, and I should note that we didn't. This isn't credit score at the time of making the loan. This is credit score in the year before the borrower is entering repayment. So that could be, in the period while they're in school, which we know, students may be subject to different financial stressors while in school than when they're not in school. They're paying tuition and they're maybe only able to hold a part-time job, and that can introduce some stress. I don't think that underwriting student loans, public student loans, is the solution here. While the credit score isn't, when you're getting a credit score, you can't take any account of the borrower's age or their racial or ethnic background. You can't you can't take any of those factors into account when assigning a credit score. But at the same time, low-income borrowers would probably be more likely to have a low credit score. I think there's some work at AEI looking at underwriting in the private market for student loans that shows that lower income borrowers are generally shut out of the private student loan market. No doubt, if we did the same thing in the public student loan market, we'd experience similar effects. There are a lot of advantages that the federal student loan program can offer in terms of income-based repayment, in terms of lower interest rates than a borrower might find on the private market.
When I ask questions, feel free for either of you to jump in, but I did want to follow up and get responses from both. But at what point would we determine it's not a good idea to give people loans, even if it's to go to school? I mean, we saw that there were a lot of problems when people took out home loans and they were in distress. And, if it's not acceptable to do it in that case, why is it still such a offhand? Why can't we discuss underwriting for student loans? At what point are we hurting the borrower if we give them more loans if they're already under distress versus helping them?
I had some thoughts about recovery from default and then eligibility again, right?
Yeah, I think, Kristen's research gives us, it is something that I think the policy community sort of needs to wrestle with, right? And I don't have like a great answer for it, but when I read her paper, I see that, so for example, the federal government says you can't get a student loan if you're currently in default on a federal student loan. That just makes sense, right? Everybody would say, well, that just makes sense. But what if you're in default on an auto loan? People say, oh, well, no, that's different. I don't know that I'm not sure that it's different, but I think one of the tricky things here is that Kristen's paper starts to show us that the federal government actually could get information from prospective borrowers that is pretty good at predicting whether or not they're going to default. And it raises this question of like, so should they? And should they make decisions based on that? I think if we want to have this sort of like a big open access student loan system, which is what we have, where we don't underwrite in that regard, because it does ensure this access, everybody gets a shot, right? This is this whole second chance thing in student loans. Is that you're not going to want to underwrite. But then I think, to the point we're trying to make in our paper a little bit, is that if you're going to have an open-ended system and you explicitly say that's what we want no underwriting, we want anybody to be able to get a loan to go to school, that you have to expect a high rate of defaults. And so you have to have really smart, sort of fair policies in place to deal with that. And I think that is a place that policymakers have just completely ignored. It's, well, we're going to ignore it, right? We don't need to deal with that. And I think mainly because I think the sort of the politics around trying to think about those policies are just, like nobody sees it really in their interest, right? So people on the far right say, well, these are deadbeats, let's punish them, who cares if the policies don't make sense? Right? And I get some of that sentiment when I talk with folks. But, I think equally sort of unconstructive on the left is this sort of like, just forgive it all. Like we can't really do either of those. And so nobody sees any interest in something that's like a little bit more smarter and in the middle, right? But I think that's sort of the connection. I'm like, if you're not going to underwrite, and I don't know that there's a big appetite to do it, then I think you gotta really make this repayment and collection stuff like smart and fair.
Is it fair, though, to not allow a student to discharge their loans if they're in dire straits? I mean, there does seem to be this subgroup in your paper, while most are able to exit the default status. There's a number that aren't. And is it really fair? I think in a lot of cases, loans are made to people who explicitly have no hope of repaying, particularly parents. Is it fair to make those loans knowing that they're just trying to do the best for their kid, but they're not going to be able to repay it, and then say, by the way, you can't discharge it?
Well, since you brought up parent loans,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we should have parent loans at all. I think we should let the students borrow.
Well, how about the grad students?
Well, I mean, grad students. I mean, they don't default that often. But look, when I showed you that chart, right, there's this 30%, who'd like never exit default, right? Or at least we can't see it in the 5 to 7 year window that we have, and they have the big balances, and clearly the policies that we have, they don't work for them, and they don't make sense for them. And I think the question is, I think that starts to raise a question of like, should there be a policy? And I think we could try to figure out what is a policy for those people that are probably never going to pay. What do we do? Because it's funny. So like if you talk to economists, right, about loans to businesses, right, and if a business can't pay back its loan, economists will say, oh, well, you got to clear that debt, right? That's just really bad to have, zombie companies walking around with loans they can't pay. It's just really bad for the economy. But that's what we do with student loans. We just let people walk around with a loan that they probably can't pay for a really long time. Now, the way that the policies we've set up is to try to deal with this is income-based repayment, right? To let people, but I think it's not clear to me that people who are defaulters are people who, maybe we'll hear about this on the next panel, are people who are willing to sort of get into this income-based repayment system.
I think the idea of discharging debt, of making student loans more dischargeable into bankruptcy, as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, like not a lot of either groups are taking up bankruptcy as an option for dealing with their debt. So because bankruptcy takes both time and money to accomplish. I think Jason's right that for whatever reason, whether it's the issue of not knowing about the program or the troubles with recertifying income-based repayment right now as it stands is not being exercised by these individuals as far as we know. I wonder if there might be some more creative solutions out there in terms of being able to link to administrative data sets to understand whether these borrowers are also using social safety net programs that indicate that they'd be eligible for $0 payments under income-based repayment. There are other ways of reaching out and identifying, the financial distress of borrowers before they hit that default status.
So do you like income-based plans? I guess I ask because it seems like now it's becoming more and more the norm to pay student loans back over 20 years. It's kind of like, a home loan, instead of paying 10 years, you pay 20 years or 25 years or what have you, and you're basically able to take on more debt. And I always think about the schools. They're able to, does it enable the schools to sort of charge more, and then the students on the back end, they can't afford the payments, and so it's kind of like, basically they're able to, pay small amounts over each month, but they have this huge debt that grows and grows.
I think income-based repayments work really well with a cap on the amount that an individual can borrow. In other systems like in Britain and Australia, you can only take out a certain amount of debt, and they have other automatic repayment and a little bit different how they set the terms of that agreement. But I think that income-based repayment is a great safety net that the federal government can provide for borrowers when as things do, things may not work out. But to your point, being able to as in the grad student program, borrow up to the cost of attendance and borrow 6 figures of debt can be difficult to reconcile on the back end in terms of repayment. Jason, I know you have thoughts.
Well, I actually think some of the things that we found in our research, right, it actually cuts against this whole income-based repayment argument. Because, and actually one of the people who helped review the paper, a researcher said, wow, if so many people are getting out of default like fairly quickly by paying off the loan, and these are small balances, I mean, are these lots of sort of accidental defaults? And so I think if you have people who have small balances and they're defaulting and they're paying them off fairly quickly afterwards, I don't think income-based repayment solves that, right? I don't think it prevents default because they may actually not really benefit from income-based repayment. Right? So if you've got a $5,000 loan and your monthly payment is $60, income-based repayment might not even lower your payment. And so it looks like I think what some of the findings in our research point to is that a lot of these defaults may not necessarily be an affordability problem in the way that income-based repayment defines it and is trying to solve. Right? It's something else.
So I was going to ask a question about, again, this group that owes about $20K or $30K. I mean, I've talked to people who owe even more, who say, I'm not going to pay anything toward it because there's no end in sight. And so why should I even pay a penny? Even with IDR, they feel like the time span is so long that they aren't going to pay it. So should there be a way that debt can be that the government can write down the debt so that the student has a end in sight to pay it off?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, this is, again, back to my point of like this tricky concept, right? Like in the private market, they'd be like, okay, well, they're not paying, we'll charge it off, we'll sell it to a collection agency at 30 cents on the dollar, and we'll let them try to get it. Maybe they can, maybe they can't, right? But like, and the private lenders stop charging interest. So they stop charging interest when they charge off a loan. And the federal government they just charge interest forever.
Why?
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting in doing this research. I didn't know that. Because actually, and I'll answer that in just a second, but a lot of times when you hear stories of people who've defaulted on their loans, like for example, maybe they took out a loan in 1993 and they've been in default since 1995, right? And they still have the loan. They have some astronomical amount of debt, and they only took out a little bit. And it sounds like there's something sort of nefarious going on, but it's actually just interest. They just have never made a payment, and interest is accrued for 30 years. And the reason why that sounds so crazy is that never happens in the private market because they just don't keep track like that. But the federal government never charges it off. So I think, to your point, we probably need some way of dealing with those loans that may never be repaid. I don't know exactly what it is, but there are a whole bunch of moral hazard problems here too, though. So people have said, well, why doesn't the federal government just stop charging interest once you've defaulted? Well, then you'd be treating people in default better than you'd treating people who are current. You can't really do. So I mean, finding some way to sort out who. But I also I'm also not sure for these loans that have been uncollected for many, many, many years, so people, they've been living with a bad credit score for a while, or maybe not. Maybe their credit score has gone back up as if they had never defaulted. And they aren't paying towards the loan. What are they really losing?
Yeah, I mean, compounding interest is a powerful thing. And when we're talking about folks that have had these loans on the books for a while, it's a problem. I do think there's political appetite for if not, tackling the problem of interest directly, at least limiting the amount that's actually repaid on the loan before the rest is forgiven, right? So in both of the HEA proposals in Prosper, it's been proposed that when you're under income-driven repayment, there are lots of, that they're restructuring the payment in lots of different ways. But one of the things that they put in is that once you reach the point at which you're paying in the dollar amount, the amount that you would have paid under a standard 10-year plan with the interest that would have accumulated, then the debt is forgiven. So it's not like you're necessarily, but they also do some weird things with time in that proposal. But in the Democrat plan for HEA Aim Higher, they do cap it so that you're never paying more than, I think it's like 50% of what your initial, it would be like 150% of what your initial principal was. So I think there is this conversation, but I think it doesn't come in modifying the interest rate as much as it comes in working to cap what you're actually paying.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I just realized Josh didn't answer your question why the private market doesn't charge interest after they charge off the loan. And what people told me was they were like, well, look, if someone's not paying $10,000 in a loan, we're just happy if we get some of that back, so we're not going to keep charging interest on it. They're sort of like, what's the point? And also they were sort of saying, like, psychologically to the borrower, if you just like keep charging them interest, like they don't even want to talk to you. But if you start talking about, we're going to charge interest.
That was my point. Like, people just stop. They tune it out.
Right.
On the Fed program, and that's why I'm wondering why does the federal program charge interest? I think I have the answer, but
again, I think it's this sort of one because they can, so they do, and so the private lenders are like, well, it's harder for them to do that, and two, again, it's this sort of fairness issue, right? Of like, can you really say, hey, if you go long enough without making a payment, we'll cut your interest rate to 0. But if you'd like to stay in repayment, well, you're stuck with the interest rate we gave you. Right? I mean, you can't do that. But if you look at stuff like tax debt, right? If people who don't pay their income taxes, the IRS actually has a process for doing what they call an offer and compromise. And I don't know a lot about them, but the IRS is at least sort of operating a little bit like a private business here and saying, well, look, you can't pay all of it. But let's figure out how much you can pay, and we'll cut a deal. Because us getting something is better than nothing. It's better for both of us, right? And we don't. I think what we have in student loan land is income-based repayment is supposed to sort that all out. I don't know that it really has demonstrated that it's doing that.
Kristen, I wanted to get back to this broader question, which is, if you restrict access, you seem to come from the viewpoint that you're going to harm these students or prospective students. And, as the research comes in, we're starting to see the same thing that happened with housing. Now, I'm not suggesting that the student loan market is going to bring down the system, the economic system. But we are seeing defaults are particularly high among black students, among poor students, and it seems to be built on this premise, your argument, that education is a good investment. And I always raise the question of what exactly do you mean by higher education? What school and what do you study and how much do you pay for that? And if your conclusion is that defaults are very high for certain groups, how do you argue that we're helping them by giving access? And maybe the counterfactual is to give them grants. I'm not saying not give them any access to higher education, but why is it still assumed that giving them loans is better than not giving them loans?
Well, higher education is by and large a great investment. To a certain, right now, the way that our system is set up, we're not underwriting the student, we're not risk assessing the students as much as we're risk assessing the institutions that we're giving the loans for, right? We have cohort default rates that those sort of turn on or off the tap of Title IV funding, which includes student loan aid as well as grants. Right now, we might not be doing as good a job of monitoring where we are actually giving those loans and to what institutions. Very few institutions are actually subject to losing Title IV aid under the cohort default rules.
There's I think 3 in the past
year.
year.
And they appeal, and it's So and that's because we've given borrowers a lot of different options for managing their debt that keeps them out of default. So I think if we want to think about ensuring that we're giving students access to loans to get to institutions that will leave them better off, we need to think about where those institutions are.
Should we think a little bit more outside the box though? Because I saw that your first, conclusion was let's just, look at the consumers with the low credit scores and let's not deny them access, but we'll, focus on them as they come out of school to give them as much help as they can. Is that the answer, or should we look at income share agreements? Should we look at schools being on the hook more for some of these loans that go bad? I mean, it just seems like I wonder how effective that could actually be at solving the bigger problem.
Well, I mean, I think we do have a sense of these borrowers are going to need more help, and there are safety nets that are largely available to them that they don't seem to be taking up. And so, if we were thinking about a first step would be to make sure that they're able to, or to understand why they aren't able to take up these safety nets. And from that point, then we can, think about other ways to provide support on the back end, whether it's through changing incentives for servicers or through, thinking about other ways to simplify repayment. But
well, I don't know. I mean, Josh, you were kind of going down this road of talking about, the loan as an investment, right? Is it such a good investment, right? But I have to wonder around these defaults, especially in light of what we're seeing in this paper, but also a little bit of what we're seeing in Kristen's paper is I don't think that I really question whether or not a default is a good measure of the value of the investment. And back to my earlier point of we're trying to do this sort of financial markets thing, right? Where if a company defaults, well, we know it was in trouble and it was a bad company, it was a bad investment, et cetera. But it was making bad investments. But I just don't know that default is a really good signal of that, right? So if you look at, for example, if you look at Kristen's, one of her slides on when she was doing her regression analysis, and you start putting in variables, and you put in monthly payment, you put in balance, you put in zip code, and those all look like they predict default. And then all of a sudden you put in credit score, and all the other stuff goes away. And it's oh, credit score predicts default. And so, but credit score has nothing to do with the value of the investment. What it's telling you is that people who are defaulting are people who have other problems with debt or have other money problems. But it doesn't actually tell you that much about the value of the investment of the loan. And also to the point of, it looks like people who can pay aren't, to a large extent.
I have more questions,
I'm going to just throw in there that there's a lot of while in my data set I know a lot about where borrowers are and the other debts they have. I don't know what institutions they went to. I don't know their actual demographic characteristics. Yep. So I do want to put a clarification on that statement that there could be a lot of other things going on that predict debt just as strongly as credit score.
Yeah, and I think there's a sort of an important distinction is that you've got sort of two groups of these sort of default prediction studies out there. They don't actually, if you could put them together, which we've never been able to do, if you could put them together, we'd have a really great picture of that we could solve some of this. But on the one hand, you have people who we know descriptions of people who defaulted. We have their demographic characteristics, the types of schools they went to. But we don't know their credit score. And we don't know their financial situation really after school. And then we have studies like Kristen's where we have their credit score and we have their financial situation a little bit, but we don't know what kind of schools they went to. Right, so you read these two different studies and think, oh man, if you just put them together, we could solve some of this.
I could go on, but I think we have to open it up. Anyone have any questions? And I could ask more if you guys want me to. Yeah, go ahead. He has a microphone, so.
I have a couple questions. My name is Charles Bird. I'm a student loan ombudsman for the District of Columbia. But I was thinking about when they talk about we know that there's a correlation with individuals with high default, low default amount. Are they coming out of default much faster because they are seizing their income taxes? Has there been any research done to kind of say that, well, this is what's happening? And I've talked to a number of individuals when they do default, whether it be garnishments and their taxes, they're getting that money right away. Has there been any?
So we cannot see in the data set that we have, we cannot see the reason for the payment. We can sort of, in fact, we can't even see payments. We can just see balances. We can see balances changing month to month, so we can sort of, well, that must be a payment, right? But we can't see why. So one of the things we do in the paper is we sort of model out, this is in the second half of our paper, the AEI paper, we sort of model out what it would probably look like if someone had their wages garnished or their tax refund taken. And it looks pretty consistent with what we see in the data. And so, yeah, I think a big chunk of the full payoffs are people having tax refunds seized or having their wages garnished. Part of this research was we interviewed a lot of collection agencies that work on this, and some people in the advocacy world, in the legal world, and in the policy world. And some of the collection agencies say, look, we don't hear from people. We try to get a hold of them. We can't get a hold of them. And then the Treasury Department, the IRS, seizes their tax refund. And then they call us. And that's when they're like, OK, what do I need to do to make this stop happening? But the other really interesting thing here is that the tax refunds, so I mean, the latest stat we have is it's like $2.1 billion a year that the federal government takes in tax refunds to pay off a student loan. And the average amount we learned in doing the research for this paper, the average refund that's seized is $1,700. So you could see how someone who defaults on $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, a couple of tax refunds, and you've fully paid off the loan. And one of the crazy things is that the Treasury Department charges you $17 per refund seized. Okay? So if you have 2 refunds taken, right, your collection costs are pretty low, right? Involuntary taken, but they're low. But if you just call up and pay that whole loan off, they're going to charge you 24% in the fees. So ironically, it would be better for you to just let them take your refund every year. That would reduce your fees. And I don't think that anybody in the federal government said, yeah, that makes sense. I think it just sort of evolved that way. But when I think that those are the kinds of things that need to be solved and sort of making those penalties more rational.
Anyone else?
Hello, I'm JJ with the American Association of Community Colleges. I'm very intrigued by the process of garnishment and tax refunding. What is the process, and why is the IRS leaving those 30% of people without garnishment or tax refunds from them? Is it a question of not even knowing that they exist, or where to seek them out in terms of their employment, which is the garnishment or IRS tax refunds?
Well, to Josh's point, they might not have any earnings. Might actually not have any money. So they wouldn't be getting tax refunds, and you can't garnish their wages because they're not employed. But we don't know. Yeah, we don't know. We just know that they're and it may be we only have a 5 to 7 year window. It may be that eventually the federal government catches up with them. But if you look at some of the budget data, and we have Justin Humphrey from the CBO who's going to be on this next panel, the budget data shows that the government does collect a lot of these loans, but it shows that there's still a loss due to default, which is some of these loans that go uncollected. But if you had, for example, if you didn't have a job where you got W-2 income. You just were an Uber driver. That was it. You just got 1099 income as a contractor. The federal government can't garnish your wages because you're self-employed. I mean, in theory they could, but you would just say no. Right. So it's not a policy that they do. And you could imagine someone strategically, if they had their tax refund taken 1 year, you could say, well, I'm not going to over-withhold next year, and then they can't take that. So I think that it's not a perfect airtight system, although relative to like what the private market has, it's pretty good.
So what is the impact of, are you basically saying we shouldn't be so worried about people who default on their loans and the economy is not going to be affected by the subset of people who are defaulting on their loans, that everything's going to be okay? I mean, what's the takeaway?
Well, I mean, no, I'm not saying that. I guess I'm saying that there are the parallels that people draw with default on other financial products are far less than I think than the common understanding lets on. And again, to this, someone who reviewed the paper and said, man, a lot of this looks like kind of administrative and accidental. It doesn't really look like a financial, like someone had some sort of financial catastrophe in their life and they can't pay. Although that happens, right? But this is almost more of an administrative paperwork problem and an enforcement problem than it is ability to pay problem.
I mean, but my work shows that when people default on their student loans, 75% of them have collections debt, and a lot of that is medical collections and utilities debt. So that's not credit card debt. That's not me taking out a mortgage, and that's inability to pay for a service.
Yeah, and that's I think that's totally fair. And I should say, I should clarify that one of the things the federal government can do to someone if, so I sort of describe this as they can pay. I mean, it's not necessarily always the case, right? Because you can create the appearance that someone has the ability to pay if you're the federal government, and you can push yourself all the way up on the hierarchy of their payments, right? By taking a tax refund. Mm-hmm. Nobody else can do that. Yeah. And by garnishing wages, saying, look, you have X amount of money, you're going to pay us first. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're in strong financial shape. I think you're right. There's a hierarchy thing that's happening here that the federal government is sort of able to insert itself in your payment hierarchy at the top, and other people can't do that.
Yeah, I think one of the things we need to learn more about is this distinction between income and wealth, right? The ability to make money versus the ability to have a reserve of funds that you can use in an emergency.
Yeah, it does seem like a lot of these loans were taken out during the downturn. Unemployment was high. A lot of people went into open enrollment schools. They didn't have a lot of wealth from their families to start with, and how much should we expect them to pay back? I mean, I feel like a lot of these loans, and I don't know how you say how much exactly, were sort of a form of unemployment insurance as people were trying to figure out what to do when the economy was so bad. And either they dropped out or maybe they did come out, but they still couldn't find a good job. And, 10 years later, they've defaulted on their loans. And
yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I can't observe that at all in my data.
I talk with the presidents of the schools, and that's what they all say.
Okay.
But a lot of the open enrollment presidents is,
I mean, we do know that risk of default is associated with non-completion of a degree, right? So going to school and not having, the credential to show for it is a big problem. And we know that enrollment in higher education increased during the recession, but
Yeah, I think one of the surprising things, though, is every year I look at the Department of Education's projections for defaults for each new cohort of loans. And they really don't change much from year to year, right? So good times, they're expecting a 20% default rate. Bad times, they're expecting a 21.5% default rate. Really good times, they're expecting a 20% default rate, right? So, and it's just been, amazingly consistent. I don't know if there's, someone at the Department of Ed that just kind of plugs in the same number every year, or if it's actually a reflection of there's just this natural amount of defaults that we're going to have, and it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the economy. And again, I think it speaks to the sort of open-ended nature of the program. It doesn't have any undermining.
On that note,
well, I was just going to say we've also had lots of changes in policy over that period as well that make it hard, make it easier to pay based on your income or do other things relative to going into default. So.
But that's why
I have difficulty untangling.
That's why I think it's so surprising that even with the advent of income-based repayment, the Department of Education, which knows full well we have income-based repayment, has not reduced its default projections.
On that note, we have to end this, but thank you so much. And please, so I guess we're going to start in five minutes. But thank you.
All right, welcome back. If anyone can overhear me in the hall, please return so we get started on our second set of panelists who will continue our conversation by discussing some of the causes and consequences of default. Matt Chingos is the director of the Urban Institute's Education Policy Program and an executive editor of Education Next. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he will moderate our panel today. He's also the co-author of Game of Loans, The Rhetoric and Reality of Student Debt, and Crossing the Finish Line, Completing College at America's Public Universities. The conversation is also going to be joined by Alex Holt. He's a senior associate at the Pew Charitable Trust, and he's currently working on a new research initiative about the challenges and some potential solutions for student loan defaults. Previously, he was a policy analyst at New America, where he studied the economics of higher education with a focus on federal student loans. We're also joined by Justin Humphrey. He's a budget analyst for federal education programs at the Congressional Budget Office, and before joining the CBO, he was an analyst with Mathematica Policy Research, analyzing federal education programs. At the CBO, he works to help score how much federal education programs are expected to cost. And finally, we have Deanne Lunan, who's an attorney and advocate for student loan borrowers at the Legal Services Center at Harvard Law School's Project on Predatory Student Lending. She's the former director of the Student Loan Borrower Assistance Project at the National Consumer Law Center and has authored numerous policy papers on student lending and assistance. So now I'll turn it over to Matt for our second panel.
Colleen. Leave off the cat person, of course.
What's that? Colleen, excuse me. We had it misordered on my paper. I'd like to give a special welcome to Colleen Campbell, Associate Director for Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. She was previously a senior policy analyst at the Association of Community College Trustees and has written extensively on student loan servicing and private collection agencies and will bring some special insights to our panel today. Thank you, Colleen.
Good to talk to Well, thank you all for sticking around for the second half of today's event. So there's an old saying about new research. When new research comes out, is it tells us something that's either that we knew it already, or it's wrong. Those are sort of the two options. Now, I think that's a little bit unfair because I think sometimes research does give us new information that can change our mind about things, and sometimes it can maybe confirm a suspicion we had, put some more precision on the problem. So I'd kind of like to just go down the line and give everybody a chance to tell us what kind of surprised you about these findings, what you thought were new or interesting, or that maybe you sort of kind of suspected was true but confirm that. And I'll kind of filibuster for a minute, and I'll answer the question first, so give everybody a minute to think about this since I knew it was coming. So earlier this year, I was preparing some testimony for this Senate committee that covers education, and I came up with this great line. I thought it was a great line about student loan default, and what it was that I said the number of people in default is rising even though the default rate is falling because student loan default is like a hotel where you check in, but you never check out. And I thought this was a really clever line. Senators didn't give it any laughs. So, and now it turns out with these new reports, it turns out it was also wrong. So I guess that's my at least one of the findings that struck me as kind of somewhat surprising. The kind of large number of people documented in the AEI report who go into default and their student loans but actually get out in the end. So tell me yours.
Great. So I'm happy to start. I mentioned to Jason, I think his paper has been quite helpful for the type of work I do. It was discussed a lot in the first panel. Are we in a student loan crisis, and is the default's going to sink the federal budget? We spent a lot of time, walking congressional staff through what happens when a borrower defaults. I think there was this belief that, once you default, that's it. The government's lost the loan completely, and we're out a fair amount of money. This would be extremely costly for the federal government. The defaults would be extremely costly for the federal government. And we spent a fair amount of time walking in through what happens. I mean, the government has a fair number of tools: wage garnishment, offsetting Social Security, offsetting tax refunds, getting people back into repayment through rehabilitation or consolidation. And so while defaults are costly, we do, I think, for loans originated in the upcoming fiscal year, CBO expects we'll get back about 90% of the principal and interest that are defaulted. So that's a loss to the federal government, but it's nowhere near the loss that I think a lot of people think of when they hear, oh, that student defaulted. Now that's for the cohort coming up. That's not the outstanding student loan portfolio. That portfolio might look different for some of the reasons that were discussed earlier on the panel. But I think his report is extremely helpful in that regard, because I think it sheds a lot of light on what exactly happens when borrowers default and what the government can do, and that's not the end of a loan. And the second paper I think is also very helpful. We always try and think through, Congress is always looking to reduce defaults and what levers can they pull to reduce defaults. And I think that paper sort of suggests it can be difficult to address that problem without doing maybe pulling levers like running a credit check for everybody that maybe they aren't interested in doing. So I thought both the papers were extremely helpful in sort of how we think about student loans.
And I am here today in my individual capacity. It's clear now that I have a lot of different hats. But for as the introduction said, I've been working with borrowers for a long time now, starting with legal aid back in the 90s, and still working with borrowers now. So neither report findings were, I would say, that surprising to me. I was first of all very heartened that the study is happening. So even though I would say the results in terms of the data were not that surprising, what I hope we're going to talk about, some of the conclusions and interpretations I disagree with, but the fact that it's studied and that people are in lots of other distress when they're in student loan default is not at all surprising. Every single person I've ever seen in 25 years has had other financial problems by the time they've come to see me. Still really important to study, and I'm not trivializing. I'm just saying that's not surprising. The fact that people, that the programs themselves that are set up to help people with default are irrational, illogical, and kind of a mess was, believe me, I can tell you, not a surprise, and I can tell you personal stories about that forever. I won't do that now. But I do think that one of the things that's really, really important with the language around this, and we can talk more about this as we go on, is whether someone is exiting and sort of exiting default the way Jason talks about in his paper, and that could be potentially sort of the end of the story for default. That's not my experience at all, and part of it's just the time period that we're able to study. So I can't tell you how many meetings I've been at, mostly at the Department of Education, and just basically begged them to study this more. I know, and I haven't been able to study it enough, but I know that a large percent of my clients who I do help get out of default go back into default. I'm open, to suggestions about how to do it. I think that we need to get into looking at, the question of some of the questions that in the other report, just of people's situations themselves and bettering their situation to help them be able to manage it, and looking towards education more of as a public good and less of a sort of personal risk situation. But I do think that we just have to be careful in thinking about default, that it's sort of over once somebody gets out of it. I'm not saying that's necessarily what you're saying, but first of all, they might redefault. And second, default itself has a lot more costs than what we've talked about so far. Even if your tax refund gets taken sort of year to year, in the meantime, you might not be able to get a license to work in a lot of states. There's a lot of, it's obviously impacting your credit score. You potentially have collection agencies, coming after you, with all kinds of problems. So I think that we also have to realize that the costs of default are also hard to quantify, even though the studies themselves are take a stab at that.
There was a lot of new information in this. I just want to give a little bit of context of what we're working on at Pew. because it really informed the way I read this paper. So Pew is a nonpartisan organization focused on data and improving public policy, and I'm part of a team that's ramping up a major project that's studying why borrowers default, exit default, and potentially redefault. And we're going to do that over the next 3-ish years. First, looking at using in-depth interviews and focus groups to speak with borrowers, both borrowers who have defaulted and not defaulted, and then building on that qualitative research to field a representative survey of defaulted borrowers. I also want to plug another team at Pew very quickly that's working on preventing default, seeking to promote successful repayment of student debt among those most at risk of default and delinquency by conducting research and, when warranted, recommending reform of loan repayment and loan servicing. But our team, the one that I'm on, is solely focused on research, no recommendations, just on default. So it was really exciting to have 2 papers all at once that were just about default. So I think what I really appreciated, both papers had a lot of new information. To me, Urban was mainly about who, these unanswered who questions of the broader financial context of people who are defaulting. And AEI was a lot about how. How are borrowers moving in and out of the default system in a way that we haven't been able to study before? So for the Urban paper, a lot of people have already mentioned the financial distress that's going on in these borrowers' lives. And for us at Pew, what we're really interested in, and this has been alluded to, is, okay, well, there's a lot of distress. What's going on? We need to fill out a little bit more, hear from borrowers about how default is affecting their broader financial lives and how their broader financial lives are affecting their decisions within default. And thank you, Kristen, for recommending that somebody go research that. That was very helpful. The other thing is, with the AEI paper, one of the big findings here is the differentiation in fees based on the pathway out of default. We don't know, I mean, you might have some ideas, but from a research perspective, we don't have that much information about what's actually going on when a borrower is deciding how to exit or not deciding how to exit in the case of involuntary collection. So we really want to understand, do they know about all the fees? Do they know that it can cost different amounts? Are they even aware of all of the different options that are available? These are unanswered questions right now, and it's something we want to dig into. But just in general, there's a lot of information in these reports that weren't even covered in the first panel, so I encourage everyone to read it. And we feel very lucky to be building our research on top of these 2 great new papers that are in the field. So thank you to the authors for that.
I'll attack this from the kind of servicing and collection side of things. I think what I really appreciated from Kristen's paper was the focus on risk and how we can really assess who might be defaulting without turning to some of the more common markers that we tend to look at, like the type of institution that the student attended, their completion status, things like that. I was surprised to learn that credit score had such a significant kind of predictive effect on default, and I think that that's an interesting, probably pretty good way of thinking about targeting borrowers who are in distress. And that could not even just be using credit score, but it could be just other types of debt on their credit reports. And that could be done in such a way that we're not giving access to kind of discriminatory data that could then lead to kind of restricting who can access student loans. From Jason's paper, I think the quantitative aspect of just the fees that people pay and their kind of circuitous ways out of default are really important. I think what's notable in there is that Jason had to estimate these things and that he could not base these things on actual data. And what any research on default ever says to me is that we need to be spending a lot more money on things like better data systems and better research and analytics on why are people borrowing, who's defaulting, how much are we paying for people who are in repayment, how much are we paying servicers, what kind of incentives are there, how much are we paying collection agencies, why are we or are we not questioning the different parts of the system, and how can we kind of reform all of these things in order to improve the system for borrowers. And I think one of the things here, I typically tend to talk a lot about low balance borrowers and lower income students and students of color, but it was pointed out that higher balance borrowers also struggle. And I think that when we think about all of the things that we need to do to fix the system, we can talk about low balance borrowers and what will help them, and those things will almost automatically help the higher balance folks. So we really should be, I think, focusing as a group on who defaults and why. So I really appreciated these two papers as a start to more research.
I want to come back to a theme of the prior panel, but I think this group could really weigh in on, which is, how do we think about this idea of giving loans to people we know are bad credit risks? I mean, on one hand, it's the point of the federal loan program, right? If we just wanted to give loans to people who were good credit risks, we wouldn't need a public loan program. The private market could probably handle it. Okay, so we have a federal loan program to give loans to people who wouldn't get credit on good terms in the private market. And we seem to like that on the front end because it's, providing opportunity to people, enabling people to make investments in themselves that we think are going to lead to good outcomes in the future, even though a private bank might not have made them a loan on good terms. But then on the back end, it's sort of a little bit like, oh crap, this is bad for people because, at least for those who it doesn't work out for. So kind of how do we think about that, and how do we sort of maybe try and balance how we think about the kind of the front end and the back end of these things? For anyone to jump in on.
I will just say I think there's a difference between opportunity and investment. And so, I think if we really wanted to invest in people who are marginalized in our country, we would be offering them a lot more grant aid than we are. The fact that we rely on loans as a financing mechanism for everyone is unfair, fundamentally. And so we really should be, considering kind of targeting upfront the college affordability side of things through increased grant aid to students and kind of targeted programs. But I also think that on the back end of things, we, again, tend to talk about income-driven repayment as potentially fixing this problem and solving this problem, but none of these programs were designed in such a way as to kind of be targeted, really. We kind of took a guess at the 150% of discretionary income threshold, as seems like it will be affordable, but we don't really know if it's affordable. And I think that we really need to be thinking about the government investing in people and folks investing in themselves, and what the difference is between those two things, and how much access the government should be providing, which is, in my opinion, a lot more.
And I'll so echo for sure the idea that we should be moving away from loans for the moving away from loans generally in a lot of ways, not just for what we might consider the highest risk borrowers, but this investment language is very much tied to the individual borrowers. And I think we need to really move toward thinking of it as a public investment in higher education, and how the costs and consequences are going to sort of flow from that. And it doesn't mean that there's no individual risk, doesn't mean that it's all public risk. It's just that the balance is way, way off right now. And we think everything's about, everything basically in the student loan program, because the gatekeeping is so lax in the school, and it has been for such a long time, so much of the onus really of the risk is all on the borrower at the back end. And so, I just really think there is room for agreement, I think, on a lot of these things, but the language itself, even the language of business and investment and all that, can be a problem. And the language of moral hazard, which comes up again, is a huge problem, in my opinion. Because I think it's where do you put your moral outrage, I guess. So, I understand that there are borrowers who, when you look at, the investment may not look like it paid off from a certain point of view, and it's important to think about that. But I also think that, where I put my outrage is not there. It's with having spent so many years working with borrowers who went to schools where they were ripped off, basically. And, it's just most of them go to school with the best of intentions, or they were told that this is where they need to go, or for all the other reasons that this is what happens. So, I want to even just look at the language of investment a little bit differently, too.
So, this question is outside the scope of what we're looking into, but I just wanted to read one thing that struck me from Kristen's paper, which is that more than half of borrowers with a credit score between 520 and 540 did not default, and roughly 3/4 of borrowers without a credit score stayed out of default in the 4 years after first entering repayment. Those numbers were somewhat surprising to me in terms of that's a lot of people who actually aren't defaulting within the study period without a credit score. It's a question for policymakers about what the right number is, but I kind of just wanted to inject it into the discussion that there are a lot of people in this study period who are not defaulting with lower credit scores.
And the one thing I think is worth noting as a side note, but there is underwriting for the parent and graduate plus loans. It's nothing like you might see in the private sector. But the Department of Education did, if people are interested in this, the Department of Education did post data on the number of people who had problems and were initially denied eligibility for some of those loans. It's kind of interesting data to review if this issue's come up several times. But it's available on the Department of Education's website if people are interested in looking into that issue more. It's kind of fascinating to take a look at. But there is some underwriting for both the plus graduate loans and the parent loans. Distinction to make.
So Deanna, it sounded like you were saying that what we need is more, underwriting's the wrong word, but more regulation on the front end about the kinds of institutions and programs students ought to be able to get federal money to go to, so that they don't get ripped off.
Well, more accountability. It doesn't have to be regulation, but something. There's a lot of existing laws that could be enforced better. So, I just want to be clear. I'm not necessarily saying we have to come up with a whole new regulatory scheme. We might, but absolutely better gatekeeping at the front end, and that But it's also a point of I don't think looking at underwriting for sure. The more you underwrite, absolutely, a consequence could be restricting access. And I just think the way that the system is and other inequality in our society and all that, I don't think that restricting access to what really is one of the, sort of right now, one of the drivers of mobility is the way to go. I just think that's why I think we need to look at the language of investment a little bit differently. And one way for sure is to have more school accountability. Lots of details about how to do that, which we don't need to get into here, but for sure.
But if we had stronger accountability in terms of restricting access to crappy programs,
right,
that would obviously have a disproportionate effect on disadvantaged students, and those are the folks who are going to these places, and that it would disproportionately affect them, and that wouldn't be able to go to those places anymore. But you would say that's okay, because we're not letting them go to places that would be bad for them.
Yeah, we're not talking about access to crap, right? Yeah. So I think
it's an important point.
Right. No, absolutely. And and I understand it's the definition of, and I'm sorry to say, of crap is is somewhat subjective, and I realize that there's details with that. But clearly at one end, I think it's quite clear programs for sure that should not exist, and then we can work for some things that might be a little bit more in the gray area. And and I also think it's important. Also, as you get more to the public good side, you're not looking at the investments solely in terms of the how it works out financially for each individual. There's other benefits of education that I think would help maybe some programs look better than they might look if the only way you're measuring them is based on the financial outcome of the graduates.
So I want to talk a little bit about federal policy, because obviously 90% of student loans are made by the federal government, so at the end of the day, this is an issue for Congress to address. And one issue I think that doesn't get enough attention is that when we talk about reauthorizing the Higher Ed Act, we often talk mostly about forward-looking things, right? Oh, we want to change the way income-driven repayment's done. We want to have one plan. We want to do one grant and one loan. We want to change the terms of these programs. We want to make Pell Grants more generous. But we could, do the perfect HDA reauthorization tomorrow looking forward, but we still have these millions and millions of people in default on their loans, from the old system, and as we kind of make that transition. So kind of my question to you all is, what, if anything, should Congress think about doing to deal with the backward-looking problem, especially if they're going to not just tinker around the margins, they're going to be really ambitious looking forward, we're going to solve all the problems looking forward. What should we do to deal with kind of the old, bad overhang of debt?
Since you teed it up, I think discharge it. Not forward-looking. I think we could be more targeted and look at some of the ideas like in the Urban Institute or other papers. But I think there's a really good argument for recognizing that the way that we did the program all these years. I'm not looking at intentions. I think there's lots of good intentions, but it led to a lot of inequality and unfair results. And so I think comprehensive cancellation and starting over again with a better.
Think discharge all the debt, or debt for people who are in distress, or?
I would say discharge all the debt. I recognize the equity issues with that, but this is a lot more of the client, not beyond the clients I work with, but I just think it actually gets more costly and difficult when you start making distinctions. Maybe going forward, you have a system that makes those kinds of distinctions, but going backward, I'd say all of it.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think there is a way that you could discharge debt in a more targeted way to borrowers who experienced substantial servicing errors, issues in their servicing that we have barely scratched the surface on. So I think that that's a possibility. I think that if we're talking in a, I'll say in a way that is probably more likely, though it is probably just as unlikely, let's be real, is thinking about this from a perspective of leveling the playing field among, if we were to simplify things going forward, we should be able to simplify going backwards. So that means if we have one repayment plan, we make it very generous, and it applies to everyone who currently has loans outstanding. If we change deferment and forbearance options, that applies to everyone who has an outstanding loan. There, I think, are ways to do this. I think that people balk because they would cost money, but frankly, we're spending a lot of money anyway and not getting great results for it. So I think that, when we talk about simplifying and doing things better going forward, we could do a lot of that stuff retroactively and help a lot of people along the way.
Probably not allowed
Probably,
to say what
it's
Congress
probably better
should
I
do.
don't weigh in on
This is
what I
nice
think they should
that
do.
Deanne and I are the only ones who can have an opinion.
And if we are going to, I'm not, yes, I realize it's not necessarily likely what I suggested, so I stick with that suggestion. But if we do parse it out a little bit, there are a lot of programs, discharge programs already in place, like ones that we're working on now for people who went to fraudulent schools. That and this is across administration, so this is not new. The information about how those discharges work and what the evidence required and how you can get the evidence to get them and all that is not available, or certainly not easily available. So we can make it more transparent about how those discharges are available and how they work, and just using some of the existing tools and actually getting them relief for the people who are already entitled backwards wise, is one way to do it without even having to create some new tools.
I mean, I think the thing I would say is that before these two papers, which added a lot of new research to the field, default specifically, federal student loan default, had not been studied that much. I mean, we have we have research. I don't want to make it sound like there was no research in the field, but this has definitely added a lot more focus to the research, and right now we still really don't know a lot about why people are defaulting. We have some evidence about distress, but we don't really know what's going on in these borrowers' lives when they're defaulting, and we also don't know what's motivating borrowers to re-engage with the system, how often it's just involuntary collection. So it's a little difficult to have policy recommendations. I think it's really important to remember that there's almost 9 million people in default, but there's really a lot we still don't know.
The one question that this work has raised for me is whether it makes sense to have the student loan market, or at least the federal part, lion's share of the student loan market, be sort of part and parcel of the credit market more generally when it comes to credit reporting, right? So we're federal loan program, we're making loans to people not based on their credit background, for all the reasons that we know and love. But then when people pay or don't pay their loans, that performance of the loan gets put into their credit record, right? And then potentially affects whether they get access to other kinds of credit. So my question is that the right thing to do? Or should we think about just separating these things and saying the federal loan program is not really a loan, it's a loan program, but it's not a loan program the way the private market is. So if you don't pay your federal loans, it shouldn't have anything to do with the rest of your credit because the credit wasn't made on the same terms as the private market.
I like that. I think the other thing we need to think about here is defaults on federal loans. So federal loans are not the same, but we've constructed the system in such a way that it mimics the private market in a lot of ways. But we also acknowledge that it's not the same, right? So I think that one of the things that we really should be thinking about going forward is just getting rid of the notion of default altogether. That was a kind of mechanical necessity from the early days of the loan program that no longer has to exist. In fact, it would streamline things a whole lot, as Jason, I think, demonstrates nicely in his paper. A lot of the issues happen between handoffs from servicers to the federal government, back to servicers. These things can kind of complicate and confuse borrowers, and I think that we don't need to have default at all. We have the mechanisms to collect on debt at the federal level. We don't have to be penalizing folks through their credit and through other means like not being able to access Title IV. These are, I think, probably what we would see is that most people try to rehabilitate their debt in some way because they're trying to access federal student loans again or federal student aid in some way again because they'd like to re-enroll in school. And frankly, we don't have to have default and the punitive ramifications of that. It just doesn't have to exist.
I think, especially from reading Kristen's paper, one question we do want to ask borrowers is how much are they thinking about their credit score and how much are they thinking about how much is the effect on the credit score having on their daily financial lives. It's something that's talked a lot about in policy circles, especially among people of higher wealth. I haven't seen a lot of research showing what the effect is one way or another in terms of how the borrowers are thinking about it or in terms of their ability to take out new credit, especially looking at the credit score over time. So in terms of the proposal, I don't know, but the one thing I would just caution is I don't even know how much it matters or how much it's affecting these borrowers.
And Kristen's report certainly suggests seems like there's a recovery, right? The effect almost precedes the formal default, and then there's a recovery.
Right, and so we just want to ask, like, how much is this part affecting you versus maybe some of the other things happening in default, like involuntary collection?
So I would agree with Colleen first about getting away from the default, which really a lot of, and Jason in his paper points this out well. A lot of the get out of default programs themselves really are relics in a lot of ways too. So lots of things that we can probably a relic too. But anyway. But no, we have the, because I remember all these programs when they started. But, I think that in response to your question, it's an interesting idea. I'd have to, exactly what Alex is saying, it's sort of like two tracks. So people, from my experience with borrowers, all of the effects of being in default on student loans, the tax refund threat, the wage garnishment, older clients I work with, the Social Security, which we forget about, but is really a big problem for a lot of people too. Social Security disability offsets too. That's not impacted by what's going on with their credit score. But for sure, my experience in people's daily lives, the credit score has a huge impact too. Public housing, any kind of housing, and all the reasons, getting credit, and so I think that it's a good idea and something to look at. But as long as all the other sort of current situation continues with when you're in federal student loan default and you can still have those tactics come at you, I don't know relatively weight-wise like how much that's gonna help people still get ahead.
So Justin, I want to ask you a question, just for you that hopefully you can answer.
Yeah.
And that's I'm just really interested to hear your thoughts on how the advent of or increase in take-up income-driven repayment, changing loan repayment behaviors, kind of potentially adds uncertainty around the scoring of the budgetary effects of these different
certainly.
programs as well as proposals.
Yeah, all of these issues that we're discussing, defaults, recoveries, they're difficult to predict. We're trying to predict how many people are going to default, how many people are going to, how we're going to collect on those loans, even whether they're going to take deferment, forbearance for 2-3 years, not do it at all. All that we're trying to project when a loan is originated. So when you add on something even more difficult to project, like income-driven repayment, even if we had perfect projections of people's income, which we don't, nobody does, but if we did, it would still be difficult to project how much that option, that benefit for borrowers is going to cost. It's difficult to estimate and project which borrowers are going to select it. I mean, we could see which borrowers, income and debt levels it's most beneficial for, but those aren't always the people who enroll in those plans. We don't even know, some borrowers may be using it as a 2 or 3 year way to lower their payments, but aren't necessarily looking at it for a 20 or 25 year repayment option. So it really does make it difficult for us to try and project how that is going to affect the cost of loans. Certainly we've made adjustments to our projections along with the Department of Education and increasing the volume and the number of borrowers who participate in those programs. I think the point was made earlier that it was, if you have a low balance, it might not necessarily be the best plan for you. We originally looked at it as a plan that either you had a really low income or a really high balance, and at least initially, and this is changing some, a lot of really high balance borrowers who are taking advantage of the program. A lot of graduate student loans. So just trying to think through all those issues has really made the loan portfolio, the cost of the loan portfolio, difficult to project.
So how does CBO think about that kind of issue of uncertainty, right? I mean, if someone in Congress wants to give a subsidy to farmers of $5,000 next year, you can come up with an estimate of the number of farmers, multiply by 5,000, it'll probably be right, plus it'll take a little bit, right? Whereas some other member of Congress wants to do some crazy thing to the loan program that involves maybe the same kind of point estimate of the budgetary implication, but with huge amounts of uncertainty. Like, how do you think about that? How do you help Congress think about risk and uncertainty?
We try to stress to staff and everybody else that there's always a great deal of uncertainty in what we're doing. I mean, we are trying to project the future, and no one is going to be successful at that. And it's even more difficult when you have a new program like income-driven repayment that is also now have several versions and people are making different choices. So we try to be upfront with them about the uncertainty of those types of projections that we're making. We also try to run a lot of different variable scenarios. Okay, let's say participation is really low in this new form of IDR. Let's say it's really high. Let's say this draws in a lot of different borrowers than are currently in IDR. Maybe it draws in a lot of lower income, lower debt borrowers that aren't currently participating. We try to run through all the different scenarios to get a range of what the costs or savings from every proposal might be. Some, like you said, we feel fairly confident that we have a fairly narrow range. But others, see proposals where we think the range could be somewhere from saving money to costing a lot of money. Then we try to end up somewhere in the middle of that range. So our estimate is equally likely to be too high as too low. And I think we're trying to do a better job of being upfront about the uncertainty of some of the projections we're making, because it is difficult, especially a loan program when we're giving out $100 billion a year in new loans, and you're dealing with millions of borrowers who are making decisions that are difficult to project what they're going to be doing. Some borrowers make decisions that are rational, but not all do, and it's difficult to try and project how they're going to react. So dealing with the uncertainty, especially in something like IDR, which is new, which we don't have a great track record, lengthy history of, is difficult.
So we're going to turn to your questions in a minute, so get them ready. But before we do that, I just kind of wanted to put one more question to the group, which is what additional information research would be most useful kind of from where you sit? And I think it's be interesting because you kind of sit in different places. Colleen, I know you've written about the need for more data and NSLDS data, and Alex Pugh is launching this big study, and Deanne, working with actual borrowers, you sort of have a different, there's stuff that would be new to us that's obvious to you, so I'm interested in what's not obvious to you and be helpful, and then obviously the CBO perspective of there's all this uncertainty, is there kind of additional research the field could contribute that might help narrow at least some parts of that on the margin?
Yeah, I mean, specific defaults, again, I think the issue, what is causing people to default? I mean, we can look at the school type, the type of school they attended, the last year that they borrowed to see if they dropped out or not. But when we're trying to, as I mentioned before, when we're trying to think through how is this policy, what would this policy change due to defaults? Is it going to reduce defaults, increase defaults? There's not a whole lot of great data out there on some of these, on what can really trigger increase or decrease defaults. So more research generally on that would be extremely helpful.
So three quick areas. I think one would be longer time, go out farther and watch people more over time to get more at some of the redefault and other issues. Another one would be the impact of servicing and collection and the contractors that are out there, and how there's been some study, and Colleen actually was involved in some of it, but there's a little bit of study, but not much on. We spend a lot of money paying contractors, and it's just not clear how effective they are from from a borrower point of view too. So I think that that would be, and then the third one would be just looking at the existing programs, the relief programs, not just IDR, but the discharge and other programs. And I know this is hard to study, but some way to measure beyond IDR, or in addition to IDR, how much people who are eligible for those programs actually are accessing or getting relief from those programs, and if not, why not?
Everything that we're going to look at. But I think that for one, just in general, a little bit like what Justin was saying, I think overall there's a lack of understanding about how students interact with the federal student loan system, what they're thinking and what the context of their decisions are. So especially with default is something we want to look into, but even there we'll be limited to a certain extent. So the more we can try to figure that out, because to my knowledge, for instance, the federal government doesn't do market testing on their policies before they implement them. And so that's one thing. The other thing is, yes, longer time periods. It's something I thought about in both the papers. Like, it would have been great to see 5 years more than what we saw. And, there is an NSLDS data set that can be linked up with Treasury that had been used for a while by some researchers, and the government, to my knowledge, can theoretically still release that to researchers in a restricted data license setting, and I think that would be extremely helpful because it's longitudinal in nature.
Yeah, I actually recently wrote a piece on CAP's website about that, so I encourage you all to read. That we really don't have good longitudinal information, as has been mentioned. We don't have good information at all on income-driven repayment in particular. We don't know how people shift in and out of different repayment programs and how often they switch, when they switch. We don't know, for example, with IDR, if people start with a zero payment, how long they stay in a zero payment. It would be great to know that. Josh made a comment on the first panel about now people are signing up for 20-year repayment programs. We actually have no idea. I mean, these programs have been around for 10 years. So we actually don't know how long people will take to repay their loans if they're in an IDR program now. Their incomes change. It's just unclear. So additional data that the Department of Education really can give us access to very, very easily would be great. We also, as Yan mentioned, spend a couple $2 billion a year on servicing and collections. Some of that is mandatory, some of it discretionary. And we have really no idea how these entities behave at all. They hold their data in terms of the records that they kind of share with borrowers. So for example, they have information on what goes on their calls, what options do they counsel them on, how often do they try to contact them, how often do they send them mailings, are they missing addresses. We don't know. We literally, that is a complete black box. The Department of Education can't even access those data. When we make changes to the servicing system, we will have better access to those data, and by that I mean the Department of Education will have better access to those data. But as we have already talked about, the Department of Education doesn't make those data available to people. So even if they have it, will they use it? And so I think that we really need to be thinking about how these data are constructed and are made available not just to policymakers, but also to researchers and the public, but also across federal agencies. So for example, Kristen's paper mentions a couple of times that it would be really helpful to know how many student loan borrowers are using means-tested federal programs. We have no idea. That's information that is knowable. We have these big data systems that we spend a lot of money on, but we simply just are not doing it, and there's a few people who are very adamant about us not having that information, not using it to the best of our ability. So I think that there's a lot of ways that we can make much better decisions, that we can help borrowers make much better decisions, that we can fix these programs, and we're simply just not doing them.
Your turn. Right here.
Hi, I'm Frank Ballman with the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs. And one thing we haven't really covered today is that really the default rate should be 0, and this whole discussion should be academic. And I think the two approaches that could move in that direction are the entrance counseling today is terrible. There's no disclosure on the federal promissory note what your interest rate, what your monthly payment will be, and you just click through a bunch of screens and you're done. There's no, as Senator Harkin called it, verification of comprehension. Because there's a couple of states that have a test at the end of the entrance counseling, and Senator Harkin saw that the default rates in those states were close to 0, and so he introduced the Smarter Borrowing Act in 2014. On the backside, I was involved in a focus group several years ago where students or borrowers were asked, so all of you are here because you haven't been making payments. How many of you got a letter from Great Lakes? And most people raised hands. Some people said they weren't sure. And then, so did you open the letter? Most of them did not. The two that did thought it was a scam because I didn't borrow from Great Lakes. So what would the panel say are the proactive steps we can take to prevent default to begin with?
I think that we're already doing some of them with the new servicing system that's being built, which I've written pretty extensively about. FSA is making a pretty substantial investment in modernizing and connecting data systems, building new tools, including a single platform for borrowers to repay their loans, so they won't be interacting with their individual servicer because there is that kind of confusion point. I will push back on the counseling side of things. I worked in financial aid and sat down face-to-face with a lot of student loan borrowers and counseled them, and they still defaulted. I think that we can, there's House legislation right now trying to mandate annual counseling for students. You can counsel people every single day on what their options are, and they will still default on their loans because they have other competing priorities. They're dealing with other financial stressors. They may hate the government. There are tons and tons of reasons for defaulting, and I think that we can do a lot better of a job with working with contractors and incentivizing them to prevent default and to do more of this proactive work, and we can build better systems and tools. But I will say that I am skeptical of kind of the student responsibility, you just need to do this and you don't understand approach.
The research is, from everything I've seen, has yet to be done on how giving information to students at different parts of the process affects their likelihood of repaying and affects their likelihood of staying out of default. It's something we talk a lot about and it's something we haven't tested that much. We plan on asking borrowers about it, but I think that to a certain extent it might need to be some type of experimental design where you're really trying to tease out how much information changes a student's ability or likelihood to pay a loan or to stay out of default versus other factors happening in the borrower's life.
Just real quickly, because I completely agree with what Colleen said about counseling, although I do think trying to improve it certainly could help a little bit. But one other thing I wanted to mention that we haven't mentioned yet is that really worries me, and the student loan debt, the private for-profit debt relief industry that's out there now, I just think we're underestimating how much that's cutting into people's perception of what's right and what's wrong and what they should do and whether they should trust their servicer or not. And I just read a new lawsuit that New York Legal Assistance Group brought against one of these companies that there were some tactics in there that I hadn't seen or heard of before either, including specifically telling borrowers not to listen to their government servicers. So, just to throw out there, even if giving people information at the exit counseling point really did lead to, A to B to outcomes or something, which I agree that it doesn't. There's a lot in between and a lot of information coming at people in between that we really have to be worried about.
I'll also note one thing that you said that's not true. We should not have a 0% default rate. That's making the assumption that everyone who has defaulted on their loan would have a $0 monthly payment under IDR, and that is not the case. You can still default on your federal student loan when we have income-driven repayment. Just a note. I hear that a lot. That is not the case. We should always have some tolerance for default in our system.
Next, got time for maybe one or two more.
When we think about when I talk about the whole credit risk, who's more likely to default, I know the predictors that we've talked about those first gens or people of color maybe three more times to default than whites. But when you think about an 18-year-old student that don't have any credit default or deficiencies or medical, how could that be determined? Who would you send a loan to, even though they may be more likely to default? How would you look at that from that standpoint?
I think this is a circumstance, if we're thinking about kind of like how we would assess risk, this is where we would have to look at some of the factors of completion status, where the student attended school, things like that. I think that we have to think too about the population of students and the population of borrowers, and the fact that we're not largely talking about traditional college students, that the majority of students enrolled in college are adults, and particularly the ones who are defaulting are struggling in this way. I did some research in the fall that showed that about a quarter of undergraduate defaulters are actually students with children, and so they would be people who entered college having a child and therefore would be considered independent and therefore not traditional college students. So I think that we need to think about the kind of the distribution of the population as well, and that largely we're not talking about the traditional college population.
And the racial gap is so troubling for lots of reasons. A lot of people here have done the research to show that, because it continues across income lines and other factors. So I think looking at like in the urban report too, looking at looking at wealth in addition to income, I think is important. Not necessarily at that point where someone's taking out a loan for a risk factor, but to help understand the full picture of somebody who is looking to better themselves.
And that too, I'll note that we see a substantial disparity between Black borrowers who have a bachelor's degree and white borrowers who have a bachelor's degree in default. And so I think that one of the things, that's a group we need to look into more as well. What types of institutions are those students attending? What are their outcomes? What are they, what do those students look like? Because clearly that's pointing to something, whether that is wage discrimination or discrimination in the job market, or if that is also kind of corresponding to where they're going to school and the types of degrees that they're getting. And that could, I think, inform some of the gatekeeping mechanisms that we were talking about earlier, where we don't allow institutions that are providing these overwhelmingly bad outcomes to students to exist.
We're out of time, so thank you all for joining us today for what I think was a stimulating conversation, and please join me in thanking our panelists.